And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and YouTube channel, Bottom Up Show. And it's also available, all the archives at opnnews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Justin Pogue. He's formerly a property manager and he's a real estate investor. And he has a new book out, Rental Secrets: Reduce Your Rent, Get Better Value, and Create Quality Communities. And the reason I'm having Justin on the show is because we talked and he said he has some ideas to help people who are facing eviction in times of the COVID crisis. So it's great to have you on the show, Justin. Thank you.
Really glad to be here, Rob.
So,
it's a great, timely topic.
Yeah, well, you know, it sure is. So what do you have to advise people?
Well, the main thrust of what I have to offer is most renters think of their landlord as their enemy. And unfortunately, that closes them off from negotiation tactics or stances that they could take on when they're dealing with their landlord, not only specifically in eviction, but in other ways too. So when you think about eviction from the landlord's perspective, it's not a single event that's going to happen. It is a process. And usually that process is notification of the tenant to the tenant that they are late, filing a court case, or actually in most cases, actually hiring a lawyer to file a court case. And then that court case will come up in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, depending on the caseload in that particular jurisdiction. Once you get to court, the judge may actually issue a judgment in favor of the landlord, but that may include another 7 to 10 days or more for the person to actually vacate the premises. So this is a long process that the landlord is going through. And the reason why that's important is because most people are not going to pay any rent to a landlord while they're in an eviction process. Their focus is going to be, I'm going to conserve my money until I figure out what I'm going to do next once this process is over. So from the landlord's perspective, that means I'm losing income over this 6, 12-week process, number one. Number two, I'm paying a lawyer. I'm paying for court fees. I still have to go in and clean up the apartment. So there's all of these costs related to this process. And that opens up an opportunity for the renter who's going through this process to actually negotiate. And the reason why is because the renter is the one who is in control of whether the landlord has to pay these fees. If the renter decides on the day they get the notice, well, I'm just going to move out and leave, none of those fees or costs are the landlord has to pay. But that's typically not.
What kind of costs are we talking about?
We're talking about the costs of hiring an attorney. If the person's already left, I don't need to hire an attorney. I don't need to file for court. I don't need to wait to rent this apartment for the next 3 months while I'm waiting to get into court. And that's vacancy costs that they're losing.
Okay, so the filing for court and the attorney, what would that cost?
It's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but it's fair to say that could cost anywhere from $700 to $1,000, in some cases even more. The rent that they're losing is whatever that monthly rent is, times however many months they have to wait to get into court in order to get.
How many months is that usually?
That again varies across jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, it can be as short as 3 weeks. In others, it can be up to 3 months. And with the situation that we're currently in, with the number of expected filings coming, that time is going to be even longer.
And actually, some people have stopped paying their rent, and
that's true.
And the landlords have been unable to file because they're held back from doing that, right?
That is correct. That is correct. So that's that eviction moratorium that everyone's concerned will be lifted on January 1st, which Congress is working on extending.
So let's say Congress doesn't do that. Or
Okay.
whether they do or not, what should people be doing to be in the best position, given that they haven't had a job and they've been able to pay their rent?
Right. So you're in that situation. One, you're going to be conserving whatever income you do receive, and with an eye towards what's going to be next for you, and figuring out what's going to be next, whether that's moving into a room in another apartment with someone else, whether that's moving in with relatives or family. Work on figuring out what that plan is if staying in the apartment is not going to be reasonable based on your expected income going forward. And then figure out how long you actually need to be in the apartment to put that plan into action. Do you really need the full 3 months for this whole eviction thing to play out? Or do you only need 1.5 to set up your next situation?
So let me ask you a question. Let's say they get rid of the moratorium on evictions.
Mm-hmm.
People have made that plan and they decide, well, it's time to leave. Are they still going to have to pay the back rent they had to pay?
They are still on the hook for the back rent. But what people need to understand is all of this is negotiable.
Right.
Landlords are in a situation where they have there's this moratorium in place. They're not receiving a lot of income. They are looking for whatever help they can get. Okay. And if a renter comes to them and says, well, I'm not going to make you wait the full 3 months. I want to move out after 1.5 months, and we can sign an agreement to that, to that effect. You get to avoid a lot of vacancy costs. You get to avoid a lot of lawyer fees and filing fees and all of that. And I will move out. In exchange, reduce the amount of back rent that I owe, or possibly in exchange, provide me with $300 or $400 to cover my moving costs so I can get out of your way and you can move on to what's next.
Wow. So how big of a problem is this? Any estimate of how many people are in this situation now?
This is huge. There are over 43 million rental households in the US across the country. There are estimates anywhere from 10 to 15 million renters who are in the situation of owing back rent, potentially facing eviction, once this moratorium is lifted.
So that's going to have a huge effect on the rental market and on all the, especially now in your book, you talk about particularly it's easier to negotiate with owners of smaller units. So somebody who has less than 100 rental units rather than big operations.
Yes.
It's got to be hitting them really hard. I mean, it's not just the tenants who are getting hurt, but if you're some mom and pop with an extra house that you're renting and all of a sudden you haven't been able to get the rent and you've had to pay the mortgage, that's got to be really hard on you just as much as it is on the tenants.
Yes.
Harder maybe because the tenants are living there for free basically.
Yeah, and what's happened is the eviction moratorium was kind of provided as a blanket moratorium, quickly passed by politicians. On the other side of that, the landlord's looking at, look, I got a mortgage that I have to pay. And those mortgage forbearance discussions kind of happened on a one-on-one basis over time. So landlords have been able to get some relief from their mortgage holders, but you still have the cost of maintaining the property. You still have the cost of property management and property taxes, of course, and all of these other things are still going on while you're trying to manage this building. So the landlord's position has been extremely difficult. So those renters who are willing and able to actually come in and negotiate and help the landlord move forward with their issues, whether it's freeing up the apartment itself or coming in and actually sitting down with the landlord and laying out a plan to either catch up on back rent or move forward. Those are the renters that landlords really want to work with. They're actually communicating. They're providing a landlord transparency on the situation that they are in and that they are facing. because the landlord is also doing planning on their side as well.
Now, are there opportunities now for people who are paying their rent to negotiate and get better deals on their rent?
Absolutely, absolutely, and you're seeing it in a lot of the major cities. You're seeing the cost of monthly rent coming down as demand for those properties comes down. As people are moving to the suburbs and they've decided, oh, we'd really like to have a backyard because that's a place where we can spend time now. Since the other offerings of the city are not necessarily as available as they once were. So actually walking into a rental situation, you can ask to negotiate, you can negotiate that price, and landlords are willing to do that because landlords have a bias towards action. And the reason they do is because if an apartment is vacant, they're not getting paid. But it's worse than that because they can never recover that money. I can't rent you the use of an apartment from last week. That's gone forever. You can't get it back. So that means if I have somebody in front of me who's willing to rent something and is willing to make a deal at a certain price, I'm going to consider that, because my alternative is this apartment may be vacant for another month and I may lose another $1,000 or $1,500 because of that.
And you get into a lot of different ways to address the negotiations with the landlord in your book.
Yes. There are several sources of power, as I call them, that renters have when they're going into to negotiate with a property manager. The first thing, and I cover it in chapter 1 because it's so foundational, is understand the concept that you can actually negotiate. This is not a retail store where you walk in and pay the price that's on the shelf necessarily.
Particularly with a smaller owner, an owner that has a couple properties or under 100 properties.
Right, because if you look at somebody who has a single family house that they're renting, their choice is between 100% vacancy or 100% occupancy. There's no in between. So it's really important that they actually have that place occupied and rented so that they're receiving revenue so they can cover the costs of owning that property.
What about somebody who's already in an apartment? Are there ways to negotiate down a rent if you're already in an apartment?
Right. Now, if you're already in an apartment, chances are you've already signed a lease. So that price is locked in for a period of 12 months from the date when it was signed. However, after the 12 months is up, there's going to be a renewal offer that's going to be made. And your landlord will say, well, we'd like you to continue on as being our renter. This will be the new rent amount. And you actually have an opportunity at that point to push back on that. And you can push back on that with, rather than me leaving and you taking a chance on another renter, why don't we knock that price down $50 a month? But it's not only that they're taking a chance on another renter. You're there, you've paid on time. You may be actually helping to maintain the apartment by doing small repairs inside the apartment for them. You've been easy to work with as a tenant. So those are things that landlords are actually considering when they send you a renewal offer. Now, if you choose to leave, not only are they dealing with a new person, they've got vacancy costs again. They've got the cost of cleaning up the apartment. They've got the cost of finding a new tenant, because that is not free. Many of these websites, apartment.com and so forth, they actually charge landlords for finding new tenants for their buildings. So there's costs attached to finding a new person. So instead of paying those costs and rolling the dice on somebody else, let's negotiate the renewal rate so that I can stay and we can both be happy.
Now, I've been in apartments for, I guess, about 12 years now. And before that, I owned a house or house. Mm-hmm. And what I found was that when my landlord, and I was in a big development where the development had 850 units and the landlord throughout the city had like 30,000 units. Big operation. Okay. Mm-hmm. What I found that helped me was, what I learned was they want to raise their rents so that it's something that's on their bottom line. So mm-hmm. even if you wanted to get something back, what they would usually do is offer a refund, a one-time refund or a credit to be used on the rent. So if they raised it $50, they would say, okay, we'll give you a $15 or $20 refund per month, totaling $180 or $240, and you can apply it as a credit as you want.
Okay.
And that way they got their rent increase and I got some break on it. The other thing that I did was I wasn't planning on going anywhere. So I arranged to extend my lease instead of 12 months to 15 or 18 months or 24 months. So when you do that, you're locking in not getting an increase for that extra period of time. So those were two little tricks that I learned.
And not only are you locking in, not getting an increase for 18 months, what they get is I don't have to worry about this apartment for an extra 6 months.
Right. But I'm asking you, is it possible now with 10 million rental situations in limbo or people being evicted, is it possible that you can go to your landlord and say, it's a different situation now. I want a better rate, not a smaller increase. I want a decrease in my rent. And I need to do a show ID. And when we come back, you'll answer that question. Okay.
Okay. Absolutely.
So do a 20-second silence so I can throw in the bumpers for the radio show. My guest for this show is Justin Pogue. He is a former property manager. He's a real estate investor. He's the author of the book Rental Secrets. He's a rental secrets strategist, and his website is rentalsecrets.net. And we're talking about both how to deal with evictions if you're a renter and how to negotiate if you're looking for an apartment or if you have one and you're trying to get a lower rent. And that's what I just asked you before the break. How does one get the landlord to actually drop the rent?
So it gets back to this basic foundational concept of thinking about the situation from the landlord's perspective. The landlord ultimately is a price taker in their market. They don't necessarily set what the price is going to be. It's what the price is usually what the market demands. And if you're in these environments where the number of people that are renting is dropping because people are moving to the suburbs and they have other interests or they're able to, work from home and they decided that home needs to be in Florida, then you have lower demand for those apartments. And that lower demand is going to impact that landlord from the standpoint of more apartments are going to be vacant for a longer period of time.
How do you
that
find
vacancy
that out?
cost is going to go higher.
How do you find out if there is a decreased demand where you are?
It can be as simple as you're looking at, actually, that's a really interesting question. It can be as simple as looking at Craigslist or some of these apartment listing services online, and seeing the numbers of apartments that are coming available on those websites. But one caveat is a lot of people think the information is available on the website, and that's not necessarily true. So an apartment community may have 10 apartments vacant, but they may only show 3 or 4 on their website to give you an idea of the different types of apartments. They may not put all 10 on their website. So it really comes down to asking the leasing agent, when you're out looking for properties, what's vacant. Actually ask to see their leasing sheet. They have a sheet of apartments that are vacant that they're responsible for. And every week they are meeting with whoever they report to about that list of apartments, which ones we've listed, how long have they been on that list, and when are the ones that have been on there longest coming off.
And you're saying that in your book, you say that the winter is the roughest time for landlords to rent. And
yes,
they may see 1/5 or even 1/10 as many new tenants coming in the winter months than in the summer months. So right now is really the best time to find a new place, or I would imagine go to your landlord and say, I want a better deal.
Mm-hmm. For those individuals who have kept their jobs through the situation, they're the ones that the landlords are trying to hold on to the most, because their situation is the most stable.
What do you think is going to happen when this moratorium on evictions is over? You're going to have people who haven't paid rent since April, May, June,
mm-hmm.
and they're going to owe a lot of money. Are the landlords going to be able to get that money?
Well, first, my guess is we're going to see something very similar to what we saw in 2008 with the home foreclosures. It's going to be a phased process. So everybody's not going to get filed on at once. They're going to pick a certain percentage, file on them, get that process, and then pick another percentage and move forward with that. As far as recovering the back rent, landlords will most likely be able to get judgments through the courts for the back rent. But the judge doesn't necessarily help you collect that back rent. That's still on the landlord to collect. Finding out where that person works, possible wage garnishments, finding out where they bank, those kinds of things. It's a long, drawn out process. But it's also supportive of negotiate with the landlord, make a plan. At any stage of this eviction process, you can go in and negotiate with the landlord to avoid any nasty surprises later on. So instead of wage garnishment, for instance, say, okay, I owe you X dollars. I'll make a payment plan with you. I'll send you X dollars each month, over this period of time, rather than getting a surprise wage garnishment 3 months down the road.
And let's say somebody has a rent of $1,000 a month. They don't live in New York City or Washington or a big city, and they haven't paid their rent for 6 months, and it's $6,000, and they've been out of work. I mean, that's going to be tough for them to whittle down.
It is. It is going to be tough for them to whittle down, and that's why the earlier in the process that you start negotiating, the better off you're going to be, because if you can help the landlord avoid the legal fees, the vacancy for 3 months while we wait to get into court and all of that, then that gives you some leverage to possibly negotiate down some of that back rent.
Is there any history of the government coming in and saying, we want to help everybody, the landlords and the tenants, so we're going to come up with 70 or 60% of what the rent was, and the tenants will be able to delegate it, that goes to the landlords, and if the landlords accept it, then they get paid, something like that? I mean, does that sound viable?
There have been both public and nonprofit efforts similar to that, where nonprofits may come in and pay a certain percentage of what's owed to free the tenant up from that particular obligation. On a government-wide level, as far as being a national program like that, there really hasn't been anything like that. And which is why, as we're dealing with this COVID thing, you're seeing they're kind of making things up as they go along with, providing checks for $300 or $600 or the $1,200 stimulus payments that were made.
It's going to go real far towards paying rent, $600.
It depends. It's an interesting question, because I think when they did the $1,200 stimulus payments, I think they just picked that because that number happens to correspond to the average national rent for a 2-bedroom apartment.
600.
Now that's it. No, 1,200.
1,200. Yeah.
1,200 is the average.
Okay.
But the average doesn't help you much depending on where you are. Yeah. I mean, if you're in California,
so we got
a few weeks.
And I just want to wrap this up. What advice do you have to somebody who's renting now, whether they are in default or not? What should they do today? What should they do in the next month or two, given that we've got this COVID situation going on?
Absolutely. Number one, get very clear on what your specific situation is and where the apartment you're in is a sustainable place where you can stay. Number two, do not be afraid to negotiate with the landlord, whether you are behind in rent or not, whether you have received eviction papers or not. You have power in this relationship that you don't know about, but you can negotiate and at least improve your situation. And that's what you want to be. So when you come out on the other side of this, you're ready to move on to your next stage.
What would be the big asks if you're negotiating?
The big ask is going to depend on where you're at. But if you're in a stable situation, you have income, your big ask is going to be to negotiate the actual rent amount that you're paying. If you're in an eviction situation, your big ask is going to be, how do we not go to court? How can we avoid that court? Because also, I don't want that eviction on my record. That judgment's going to follow me. So that's another aspect of this whole thing. But yeah, your big ask is going to be, how can we avoid having to go to court?
Okay. So, any final words?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, I think people should take a look at rentalsecrets.net and take a look at the book if it sounds interesting to them. And always, always, always think about negotiating with your landlord, because they are people and they have problems too. And if you can help them with their problems, they will help you with yours.
And I have to say, it's a good read. It has valuable information in it. I acted on some of it while I was reading the book, which is great, really. And again, my guest for the show has been Justin Pogue. He is the author of Rental Secrets, and his website is rentalsecrets.net. His website is rentalsecrets.net. He's a former property manager and he's a real estate investor. It's great to have him on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate the chance to talk to your audience.
Let me do that again without my phone making noise. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the chance to talk to your audience.
Okay.